All right, I think we'll go ahead and get started with our second panel, which looks at the potential impact of unification on the region. Moderating the panel is the Wilson Center's own Robert Daly, director of the Kissinger Institute for China and the U.S. Robert, thank you.
Thank you, James. Thanks to all of you for coming out this afternoon. I'm very glad to moderate this panel on Northeast Asia and Korean unification. When we speak of unification, of course, we're speaking not only of the coming together of two political entities that have been separated for 60 years, but we're also talking about the re-inclusion of these two entities that have functioned practically as islands for 60 years into the Eurasian mainland and into Northeast Asia in particular. And so it's very important to have an understanding of Chinese and Japanese equities in a unified Korea, and also to understand the role that the peninsula plays in the cultural and historical imaginations of China and Japan, and how that may influence their views of a unified Korea going forward. We are very happy to have with us to discuss these issues Ambassador Stapleton Roy, who was the founding director emeritus of the Kissinger Institute and is now a distinguished fellow here at the Wilson Center, former American ambassador to China, Indonesia, and Singapore. Narushige Michishita, who is a scholar at the Woodrow Wilson Center's Asia program and is also professor at the National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies in Tokyo. Professor Sun-Hyung Kim, who comes to us from the International Studies Department at Handong Global University, and Professor Chang-Hun Cha, who is with the Department of Political Science and Diplomacy in Pusan National University. Their full biodata are available at the door. I encourage you to get that on the way out if you didn't get it on the way in. So we will begin with Ambassador Roy on Chinese views of Korea. Ambassador Roy.
Thank you, Robert. Actually, I'm going to be a little bit broader than simply the Chinese view. I think it's very important to realize that the Korean Peninsula cannot be viewed in isolation from its geographic location in Northeast Asia. In our morning panel, somebody made the point that Korea, as an entity, had not been a threat to other countries. But in fact, Korea was a threat to all of its neighbors because it was the crossroads through which they mounted invasions of other countries. So we have the Hideyoshi sending his armies to overthrow the Ming Dynasty, and we have the Mongol invasions of Japan, which took place in Korea. We have the Sino-Japanese War. A decisive land battle was the Battle of Pyongyang. In other words, it was fought in the Korean Peninsula, but it was a war between two other countries. Most Americans aren't familiar with this history. And it's a major setback for us because all of the regional players in Northeast Asia are aware of this history and view Korea in terms of how Korea has factored into their own threat perceptions. For example, for China, Korea has been, during the 20th century, the route by which China was invaded as Japan rose as a major power. So you have the carving off of the three Manchurian provinces, and then you have Manchukuo being used as a base for the Japanese invasion of the China mainland. And the Chinese are very conscious of that. And the Korean War, again, was an example. I cite the Korean War because it shows that the Americans had great difficulty understanding the threat perceptions of the Chinese. For example, General MacArthur had his best intelligence people work for 3 months on the question of whether or not, if we went north of the 38th parallel, the Chinese would come into the war, and they concluded they wouldn't. And so we pushed up to the Yalu, and the Chinese came into the war in major force. We now know from the history that, in fact, Zhou Enlai told the Russian ambassador a week after the war started that if the UN forces crossed the 38th parallel, China would come into the war. So we clearly were simply not understanding the way that China viewed the Korean Peninsula in terms of China's own security interests. This is a very important factor because Korean unification is going to have a major impact on the interests of all of the major powers around the Korean Peninsula. I can remember talking to a very experienced Japanese diplomat about Korean unification and what the Japanese attitude was, and his response was, we're okay with Korean unification as long as we don't have the three N's. Nuclear, in other words, no nuclear, no nationalism, recognition that Korean nationalism is anti-Japanese to a significant degree, and no neutrality, meaning they couldn't afford to have a unified Korean peninsula that would drift out of the Western alliance system. So that reflected a Japanese view of the question. If you talk to Chinese, the question of having U.S. forces north of the 38th parallel is something that they can't tolerate. Even if you had a unified Korea peninsula, in other words, the importance of the geographic area of North Korea, even if North Korea was absorbed into a unified Korean peninsula under a South Korean type of government, that's not going to eliminate China's concern that North Korea not be a location for potentially hostile foreign forces. So these are factors that have to be integrated into our thinking about if and when we are able to achieve a unified Korean peninsula, how do we ensure that that Korean peninsula is able to thrive in a region where the other major powers, and I'm talking major powers, Japan, China, Russia, these are big, powerful countries, and the United States has interests. But of course, the dominant interests are those of the Korean people themselves. And I've been told by Koreans that if unification becomes possible, other countries should keep their hands off and let the Koreans handle it. It's not going to work. Other countries are going to be involved in it, and for unification to take place in a way that can potentially contribute to stability and peace in Northeast Asia, somehow the interests of these other countries have to be accommodated in some fashion. We can't just accommodate Chinese interests or just accommodate Japanese interests or just accommodate U.S. interests. There has to be a way of integrating all of them together. And I think this issue is particularly important because we spend a lot of time worrying about how we would handle a Korean collapse or a North Korean scenario or a unification operation. But the problem is the United States and China do not have a common strategic view of how a unified Korean peninsula would be positioned strategically. We would like to have a unified Korean peninsula with the U.S.-ROK alliance still intact. I can guarantee you that will not be acceptable to the Chinese. And if the Chinese are opposed to Korean unification, is it likely to be able to be successfully carried out? That's a question. So we have to think about these issues because it would be enormously different if, for example, South Korea, China, and the United States had talks about what our visions were of how a unified Korean peninsula should be positioned in Northeast Asia. Not the question of how you achieve unification, because that might involve issues the Chinese are not prepared to discuss, such as collapse of the North Korean regime or even overthrow of the North Korean regime. But the question of how you would position a unified Korean peninsula. It might turn out that we had incompatible strategic objectives, and that would tell us something. But if it turned out that, in fact, we had compatible strategic objectives, then if contingencies involving North Korea were to arrive, there would be some basis for confidence that we had strategic objectives that were not going to be in opposition to each other. Whereas at the moment, a South Korean intervention in the north, the Chinese would assume that the United States was behind that, even if we weren't, and the Chinese would assume that we had hostile intent toward China, and therefore they would be likely to intervene in opposition. So these are some of the considerations that make, I think, this particular panel so important, because it's this Northeast Asian context that is going to be a vital determinant of whether or not Korean unification can take place in a manner that accommodates the interests of all of the powers, including the Koreans themselves, in a fashion that contributes to peace and stability. If Korean unification occurs and does not contribute to peace and stability in Northeast Asia, we're going to see history repeat itself, and the victims will be the Koreans, because that's been the pattern of great power intervention in Korea in the past. And so I really think that this is an issue that I hope we can have a very lively discussion on. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Roy. Professor Machista.
Thank you. Let me talk about three things today. One is how the Japanese people are looking at unification of the Korean Peninsula. Second, what are the contingency plans that we have in the case of collapse of North Korea? And third, the possible Japanese role in the process of Korean unification. First, let me talk about how we look at the the future of the Korean Peninsula. There is an interesting Japan-South Korea joint public opinion poll conducted earlier this year by the Japanese institution called the Genron NPO and the South Korean institution called the East Asia Institute. And the question was posed to the Japanese respondents: what will the Korean Peninsula look like after 10 years? And the largest number of people, 42.1% of the respondents said nothing will change. So there will be status quo. And 13.5% of the respondents said South Korea-North Korea confrontation would be intensified. 9.6% minority, small number of people, said the two countries will move toward unification. And finally, 33.9% of the people said they couldn't predict. It was too difficult. So basically what people are saying is that we don't foresee a major change in a foreseeable future. And as a result, people are not talking about unification. People are not talking about the collapse of North Korea. They are not necessarily interested in getting ourselves prepared for Korean unification process. Let me turn, however, we think about, and we have actually think about, not necessarily recently, how to respond to contingencies on the Korean Peninsula. Particularly, we have two scenarios. One is a big war scenario, and the other is a collapse of North Korea. And in both cases, there are two big issues. One is the issue of how to evacuate Japanese citizens from the Korean Peninsula if needs be. And second is how to take care of refugees coming out of North Korea. And the Japanese government really took a look at this in the late 1990s. And actually came up some, rudimentary plans. And why did it do so during that period? Because it was just after the collapse of communist bloc countries, collapse of the Soviet Union, and a large number of people were predicting early collapse of North Korea. So that was why we had to get ourselves prepared. In terms of non-combatant evacuation, how we rescue or kind of bring Japanese citizens living on the Korean Peninsula, either in north or in the south. Well, we talked to the American friends and we are allies, and we decided basically we'll conduct joint operations in which the U.S. will use their assets to help us evacuate our citizen Japanese nationals out of the Korean Peninsula. But we couldn't go too far as to discuss and realistically plan possible dispatch of self-defense force Japanese armed forces, aircraft or vessels to the Korean Peninsula because of political sensitivities. But it's kind of put us in a difficult position because they are limited only. Even the Americans have only limited number of assets capable of transporting personnel and the necessary resources and assets, and they will be busy taking care of themselves, and they will might not be able to spare some room for Japanese nationals. Well, some people are certainly arguing, well, we can use commercial aircraft, commercial passenger aircraft to do the same. But I mean, it would be very difficult for Japanese JAO, Japan Airlines and pilots and all the people working on the planes, aircraft, to dive into a Korean Peninsula in crisis. They would have a second thought. So we have plans. As a result, we came up with a plan, but it was not really a realistic and credible plan, unfortunately. And in terms of how to deal with refugees coming from North Korea, we were talking about, assuming that possibly several tens of thousands of North Koreans will come out, and possibly they will come across the Sea of Japan to the Japanese territories. Why? Because there are about 100,000 Korean residents, Korean people living in Japan in the 1950s and 60s. About 100,000 of them left Japan to emigrate immigrate to North Korea. So they are, and now it's been 50 years since then. So they must be their kids already, and there are large number of family members and larger number of family members and relatives that they have. Some of them certainly have died, but they have their kids and living in North Korea who have relatives. In some cases, even families. Members are still living in Japan right now. So they might decide to come to Japan to look for help from them. So we made some plans to how to talked about how to accommodate them. But again, the North Korea became a little bit, our assessment about the stability of North Korea changed over time, and North Korea collapse scenario. We always, ask this question: when is North Korea going to collapse? And any time you ask this question, the answer is 20, 30 years, right, from now. So we asked this question 20, 30 years, ago, and the answer was the same. And we ask the same question today, and we say the same thing. And finally, what would be a Japanese role in the process of Korean Peninsula unification? Unfortunately, as I said, we are not people in Japan, policymakers as well as people, ordinary people, are not really talking about the unification issue because it's not an urgent policy issue. So when we have conduct public opinion polls on foreign policy, we stopped asking this question. So what would you support or do not support Korean unification? So we can. It's hard to know for us right now how many Japanese would support the unification and how many would not. But my gut feeling is that, because of the deterioration in a bilateral relationship between South Korea and Japan in recent years, there must be larger number of Japanese people kind of reluctant to see the unification on the Korean Peninsula than before. Because, several years ago, if you ask this question, large number of people, more than 70-80% of the people supported the unification, but now maybe less number of people support it. And in terms of policymakers, Japanese policymakers and experts, it's very hard also to find out what they think because they don't tell you the truth, right? Because they always try to be politically correct. But I would say, having with the experience of having talking to policymakers and specialists in Japan, I would say about half of the people are for the unification and another half is against. And so if you ask the question to me, I would say actually it all depends is my question, the answer. Because what I'm saying is, it's if this is about creating a peace-loving, as the ambassador said, peace-loving unified Korea, free of nuclear weapons, and which is willing to maintain amicable relationships with its neighbors. The answer is certainly yes. But if this is about the creation of an anti-Japan, anti-US unified Korea armed with nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles, the answer would be no. So it's simple. And when I talk to Japanese policymakers and specialists, they answer the questions, and I ask why, and then they say, well, because some people say yes, because unified Korea would have to rely on our help, assistance, political as well as economic, financial support, in order to achieve a successful unification. So they cannot be hostile to us. Therefore, the answer is yes. And some other people say, well, because unified Korea will inevitably become anti-Japanese. So the answer is no. So what I would like to see South Korean, particularly its leaders, to do is to come out and say, we will try our best to build a peace-loving, unified Korea, free of nuclear weapons, and willing to maintain amicable relationship with its neighbors. And they have to also tell us that in order to achieve that goal, they are taking, or at least are going to take this and that specific measures to prepare for successful creation of peace-loving Korea. So, for example, in terms of dismantling of nuclear weapons and missiles, they have to think about how to finance the process, who will do the job. It's not going to. Is it going to be a South Korea only process or multinational process? It would be very hard for South Korea, nuclear weapon states to allow South Korean government to take care of this, directly engage in dismantling process of nuclear weapons. So that can create some issue of sovereignty issue between nuclear weapon states such as the United States and the unified Korea. How would you try to solve this issue? And in terms of unification, economic integration of two Koreas, who would, do what, and who will finance how much. And during the presidential campaign of former President Lee Myung-bak, he maybe as a slip of tongue said Japan would pay $10 billion for Korean unification. And the Japanese government protested it, and he quickly, this said no. But it's a kind of thing. But, our question is, well, before you ask us how much we will be willing to pay, you have to tell us what we are going to get out of successful Korean unification. And finally, anti-Japanese sentiment. I would say that inevitably Korean unification process will be a very divisive process. There will be a lot of frictions between the people in the south and the people in the north. And even among the people in the North Korea, people living in Pyongyang and people living in other places are living in entirely different worlds. So how can we bring them together? And it would be quite easy, unfortunately, for the leaders of a unified Korea to use anti-Japanese or possibly anti-US sentiment to unite the nation. So I would really hope that South Korean specialists as well as leaders sit together and discuss how to create a mechanism or situation whereby peace-loving South Unified Korea friendly to Japan and the United States will be created. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Michishita. Professor Kim.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Daly. I'm really honored to be invited to speak up here, sponsored by the renowned Wilson Center. And it's really good to be back to Washington because I studied here at George Washington University. And then my two daughters, one is working and one is studying here. And and I met them yesterday.
Wow, good for you.
And Ambassador Roy talked about Korea as is not a harmless. It can be a threat anytime not because of its action, but because of its geostrategic location. And John Mearsheimer talked about the geohistorical or geostrategic geopolitical curse with Poland or Balkan peninsula. And morning session, Barbina Huang talked about shrimp among big whales, and even we grow up so much, it still feel like big shrimp rather than small shrimp. But in Korea, we changed that, and we want to be a dolphin among whales. But you know what? It's 6 countries. Actually, by military budget, number 1, 2, 3, and 6, and 7. And one, it has nuclear power. So this is a really hard security structures. And the more we talk about unification, the more pessimistic we're becoming. And that's really irony that whenever we talk it's running away from us. So I want to talk about this security complex and Korean reunification. And let me start my opening statement with the late Dr. Egon Bahr's major thoughts. You may be familiar or not. He was called Kissinger of the West Germany, and he was the architect of the Willy Brandt's Ostpolitik. And he argued that West Germany never pursued the unification. Brandt's policy was mainly a status quo, pursuing relaxation of security tension, not revisionist policy. West Germans did not pursue the collapse of East Germany, or even talked about unification in public. Another important point from him is that their policy start with the neighbors. And Ambassador Roy talked about that, right? And the importance of that. Not East Germany. Especially they worked so hard to relieve Soviet Union's suspicions toward the West. What we should learn from this is that Korean reunification is not just Korea's own problem. Rather, it is an issue of whole East Asia, if not a global one. It is impossible to achieve unification without the help or participation of the US, China, Japan, and Russia. An independent unification sounds wonderful and makes Koreans proud, but not realistic at all. The issue of Korean unification deeply intertwined with the security structure of East Asia. That is why we should focus more on building favorable security environments even before talking about the unification, and trying to promote a good relationship between Pyongyang and Washington would be a more effective way to achieve unification faster, if possible. However, the reality we are facing is that East Asian security environment have recently been rather pessimistic. Despite growing interdependence in the region, there are so many fault lines that could trigger conflict in this region. North Korea's continuing provocations, ongoing territorial disputes, an unsettling rise of China, and the apparent U.S. intention to contain China through fortifying an alliance network in the region. President Park repeatedly drummed up public interest in Korea's unification since last year, saying that it would be a bonanza, 통일 대박, for two Koreas as well as blessing for neighboring countries. During her recent speech to the UN, as well as summits with Xi Jinping and with Obama, Park asked for cooperation in her vision for unification. Although bringing the unification issue to the center stage sounds very sudden, it makes sense, since unification could not only touch off massive investment in the north, but also solve many, persistent headaches, including nuclear deadlocks. I understand how much frustrated she is, and however, can unification be achieved? That is the question. That is goal, or there can be a goal or exit, even though Jonathan Pollock, no exit. But there is neither an entrance nor process. Pyongyang has been wary of Park's unification drive, suspecting, sort of plotting to absorb the North. To make Korean unification a realistic goal, we should begin by easing the tensions between the North and the South Korea. The deteriorating relations between the two Koreas have provided a justification not only for Cold War-like alliance versus alliance system, also a revival of Japan's militarism. President Park should distinguish between the goals she can achieve and those are cannot in her remaining term. Unification as well as denuclearization of North Korea is not likely achievable in her term, in that time frame. Easing tension with the North seems achievable. Similarly, the ability to significantly influence the behavior of two superpowers probably cannot be achieved. And the ability to play the role of facilitator or mediate between the two is possible. I'm not talking about, argue over balancer. I'm not talking about that. Okay, Northeast Asia today is like pressure cooker filled with steam. I think many of Koreans is familiar with this, rice cooker, the steaming. A pressure cooker has a critical part called steam vent tube that allows excess pressure to be released slowly lest the appliance explode. Sometimes it does explode if that, is gone. Only sophisticated diplomacy, South Korea must take the role of release this valve in the region as best it can. Only sophisticated diplomacy can put a silver lining around the storm clouds forming over the volatile region. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Kim. Professor Cha.
Thank you, Robert Daly. Good afternoon. So it seems to me in the afternoon there's broadcast cameras gone and reporters gone. It means I'm free to talk. Thank you. I'm from Busan National University. I'm also pleased to be here to have opportunity to speak Korean unification at this World Relations Center because I just get back spent after DC after spending sabbatical year last year at Georgetown, so in 3 months. So first of all, I'd like to bring newly emerging issue of China factor. It is called as One Road, One Belt initiative. And secondly, I'd like to just to provide my perspective on this implication for Korea unification. Let me firstly briefly introduce the One Belt, One Road. This is a new Silk Road economic belt and the 24th century maritime Silk Road. I call it OBOR. Initiative were proposed China 2013. It firstly initiated. The Chinese government issued an official document on March 28, 2015 to lay out the major principles and priorities for OBOR. The OBOR conjures a massive land and sea-based infrastructure project linking some 60 countries from China through Central Asia to Africa and Europe. So it covers on Eurasian continent. As it stands now, the OBOR is supposed to cover 55% of world gross national product and 70% of the world's population and 75% of non-energy sources. It reminds us of the ancient, Silk Roads, and it's also trying to try to cover all the sea lane. So, of course, it was China. It was initiated by Chinese government to expand or readjust Chinese economic development rather toward westward, rather than East Coast line, which was developed by since open door policy. I do not talk about this matter in more detail. I just want to provide any implication for unification. One thing, most observers that see that this OBOR as a Chinese kind of grand strategy to rebalance United States Asia policy, or some people call this is west to pivot to west, kind of that. But it is always hard is to talk about this matter, but it just launched just so we can see what happened in the future. But regarding Korean unification, it is surprising to see that the Korean Peninsula is missing in this blueprint. So I thought, why? I even I asked these Chinese scholars while I visited just a couple of days ago in Beijing. I think it's the simple reason is this idea is going westward, So as you see, Korean Peninsula is the eastward of Chinese continent, and the second reason is, as you see, Korea is divided north and south, and materially North Korea is a kind of a blockade to going southward, including South Korea and Japan. So of course it means I think that there is kind of hindsight that China tried not to challenge or face interest of United States in this Korean Peninsula. Of course, these things. So what does it mean this OBOR for the Korean Peninsula or Korea unification? I think at this moment it's very difficult to say or predict in the future. But I can catch this Chinese blueprint because I can just get kind of lesson or for the Korean unification, because whether the OBOR will be performed well or not, but it engages a lot of money and economic development and people-to-people contact. So if it should be done, it will be done. It will be done. Maybe Chinese influence will be greater and great. But I'd like to just pick up this idea of the kind of framework of engaging people and company or government. I think this kinds of thing is missing in Korean Peninsula. There will be rare dialogue between South and North Korea, rare people-to-people contact, rare investment, as we have heard in the first panel. So so far that nuclear is so dominant. So the government in this region try not to talk. They heard, as we have heard from the Ambassador Kim, former Ambassador Kim in Korea, said the government tried hard, but it is not easy, as you have seen. So I'd like to suggest that the Korea nuclear issue should be divided by just nuclear issue and North Korea problems, like human rights or economic development. So that kinds of approach should be required to improve or maintain stability or prosperity and peace in this region. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Cha. I'd like to ask the panel a question before we go to the audience. And the front half of the question is primarily for you, Ambassador Roy, and then I've another aspect of the question for our Korean experts, and also there's a Japanese angle. You began by speaking about geography really as the central principle that has to be considered. In consideration of that geography and history, it is, I think, extremely difficult to imagine a reunified Korea not inclining toward the lodestone of China over time, by virtue of geography, economic interest, deep cultural affinities, both ancient and modern. In ancient times, Chinese cultural influence on Korea, and in more recent times, of course, the very important Korean cultural influence in China, which is extremely powerful. We have roughly 3 million ethnic Koreans who live in China, and these are divided into several different groups. Some of them have been there for many generations. Some of them are newer, but they're deeply woven into the fabric of China. Cui Jian, the godfather of Chinese rock and roll, is a Korean from Shandong. Korean soap operas and movies and music, all of these influences would seem very strong. What then, Ambassador Roy, should a realistic U.S. expectation be about a unified Korea's ability to maintain neutrality in the light of this geography and these economic and cultural forces? That's the first part of the question. The second part of the question, which is for our Korean friends, is that obviously speaking against too strong an inclination toward China are Korea's own fears about Chinese quasi-suzerainty and something like client status, as well as some cultural concerns. We saw the flare-up in 2002, the latest version of the Goguryeo question, where China tried to move through UNESCO to claim, in essence, that one of Korea's 3 ancient kingdoms was, in fact, primarily part of China's cultural inheritance, and this was something that united North and South Korea. So how do you see a unified Korea balancing its interests vis-a-vis China and its concerns? And then lastly, you mentioned the 3 N's, nationalism,
Right.
Nuclear. Were you the 3 N's?
Yeah.
Oh, this question of neutrality. Does Japan see, how does Japan see prospects for real Korean neutrality from a unified Korea going forward, or is the impact of China simply too great? Ambassador Roy.
I think we shouldn't exaggerate the China's ability to dominate East Asia. Historically, it was never able to dominate all of East Asia. It could only dominate the land portions of it. It failed in its efforts to dominate the maritime portions. I mentioned the Mongol invasions of Japan that failed. The Mongols also sent tens of thousands of troops to Java with hundreds of vessels and were able to land, and then their allies turned against them and they failed. So China was always a land power. And if you look historically, and I think a Korean speaker this morning made the point, Korea, Vietnam, Myanmar exist because they were resistant to being absorbed into China. That's not going to change. And now we're in a Westphalian world where you have nation states that are technically equal and are just as devoted to defending their territorial integrity and sovereignty as the Chinese are. So that I have great confidence that Korea will be able to maintain its integrity as a Korea on a unified Korean peninsula, even though China is a big, strong power next to it. Does that answer the key part of the question?
Yeah, the question about sort of the assumption of American policy going forward, and that is an answer. That
Yeah, I think Americans think of, that if we weren't there, that somehow China would dominate all of East Asia. I think that's an exaggeration because China is surrounded by major powers whose histories all cause them to not wish to see an East Asia dominated by China. And that includes Russia, includes India, it includes Korea, Vietnam, Myanmar, etc. So that China will have an instinct to want to dominate East Asia. But I think that in the modern world as it exists, and given the fact that the United States has played a continuing security role in East Asia ever since the end of World War II, I just do not think that the geopolitics of East Asia is going to lend itself to domination. Quite frankly, I think it's China's soft power that may be the dominant factor in East Asia as opposed to hard power. Because I think the resistance to Chinese hard power is going to be real and sufficient to force China to accommodate itself to its neighbors. But the strength of China's economy, which we already see in the fact that China is the principal trading partner of most of the countries of East Asia, including all of U.S. allies, suggests that if China plays a skillful hand, its neighbors are going to all wish to maintain a good relationship with China, despite their security concerns. And so the real question is whether the United States can somehow capture that dynamic in order to not contain China, but to simply create a situation where the rewards for a China that behaves responsibly are strong, and the deterrents for China behaving irresponsibly are also strong. And I think that East Asia lends itself to that. And we can already see it in the reaction to an assertive China that has emerged since 2010. It's created problems for China's peripheral diplomacy that has forced them to concentrate on trying to improve relations with their neighbors, because their assertive behavior causes their neighbors to run to the United States looking for greater security support. So, I mean, that's a dynamic which skillful diplomacy ought to be able to capture. But we don't always have skillful diplomacy, of course.
Professor Kim, Professor Cha, for the past 60 years, the border that's mattered most is the DMZ, when the border that matters is the border up on the Yalu and the Tumen rivers. Do you share Ambassador Roy's confidence that Korea can work this balance?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. And North Korea actually was very good, like a pendulum policy between the Soviet Union and the China. And we survived for a long time. And actually, I think it's Sun Chu's dictum as, have a good relationship with a faraway country and have a, tension or attacking and neighboring countries. I think in some part it applies too. And cultural affinity doesn't mean that we have the same interest. And Korea has a fundamental fear that the too big China is more dangerous than any other big country. So in that sense, and one more thing is for 60 years and several thousand years compared to the 60 years of a recent one, and we are so ingrained in the same democracy and capitalism and that alliance, I think this is more solid than the history too. And then But I'm not saying that we have to pick one. So I think this point leads to your second questions. Which one is? I think we need to compare. Okay, balancing without unification, before unification easier, or balancing after unification easier. Definitely, my opinion is the latter, not the former one.
Professor Cha.
Let me respond to your question. 2 points. I think it's very natural thing for United States to be worried about Korea's inclination to China, as you think it is. But no, the United States is far away from East Asia geographically, and Korea is just neighborhood of China, and economically it is more and more interdependent. So, but I can briefly answer to it. But United States don't need to be worried about this matter, because until China would be democratic country, it contains a kind of value system. So as far as China remain authoritarian regime, Korean people, maybe public or intellectual leader, they do not faithfully believe in China as a as that has a kind of polity. The second thing is it's kind of personal view. The opportunity or chance to be unified in Korean Peninsula might be more and more swindled. I mean, given the fact that the conflict and competition between United States and China would be intensified in the future. So I think the time is, the level of resolution or the way to Korean to be unified Korea is more and more complicated. So in that sense, time is running out. So that's what I have in mind. So we can create more lots of opportunity to be engaged with North Korea, with surrounding country, not only for, as I told before, people to people, business or diplomatic or political, lots of engagement should be expanded in the future.
Professor Michishita, any responses to your colleague's remarks?
Yeah. You might have asked me whether neutral unified Korea is possible. I would say actually unified Korea allied with the United States is possible. Why? Because China with its massive growing capabilities and weight still will not be able to. I mean, some Chinese specialists or Chinese scholars might be saying that acting like as if China can prevent Korean unification from happening, but I don't think so. I mean, if North Korea collapses and DMZ breaking down and a massive flow of North Korean people from northern part of Korean Peninsula toward the south taking place, I mean, nobody could stop it. And if China is to stop it, it really have to occupy the northern half of the Korean Peninsula, which is a nightmare for China, I would say. Nobody would like to have North Korea in such a shambles situation. And also, if China ever tried to do so, that would drive the Koreans away from China and toward the U.S. and Japan. And And also, China is becoming more, kind of important, influential. Therefore, over time, I would say South Korea or unified Korea will start to think about balancing against that, China, growing Chinese influence. And there are early indications of that, which we can see in some of the result of the opinion polls conducted in South Korea. Let me talk about some. There was a opinion poll conducted in South Korea in 2013, and the question was which country would become a larger threat or would pose a larger threat to the unified Korea. The answer was China is in the first place with a 47.3%. Japan was in the second place with a 38.4%. And the United States was in the third place with a 9.1%. And actually, in the previous year, in 2012, the result was more interesting because China came in the first place with a 61.1%. Japan came in the second with 26.4%, and the US was in the third place with 8.8%. And also, there was another interesting question asked in 2012. Again, it's a little bit old, but it's kind of good because it actually was, this poll was conducted before this anti-Japanese sentiment in South Korea flared up. So it might actually better reflect the reality of South Korean sentiment or assessment of strategic realities. And the answer, there are two questions. One question was, which country poses the largest threat to South Korea right now? The first answer was North Korea with 37.8%, Japan with 27.8%, China was in the third place with 18.3%. And there was another interesting question: which country will pose a larger threat after 10 years? And the answer was China was in the first place with 40.9%. North Korea was in the second place with 21.0%. Japan was in the third place with 20.0%. So I would say, the South Korean people, and I would say leaders as well, vaguely understand that possible problems that change in strategic balance in East Asia in favor of China might have for the future of unified or ununified Korea.
Okay, well, thank you. I would like to open it up now to questions from the audience. Do we have microphones? We do. Good. Please raise your hand. Yes, sir, right up front here.
Is it working? Yeah. Hi, thank you. Mike Billington with Executive Intelligence Review. Dr. Cha, you said that there was concern that China was not so interested in the Northeast and the Tumen River and so forth. 3 questions I'd throw to you on this, others too. They're all related. I understand that in the bilateral meeting between Xi Jinping and Park Geun-hye at the trilateral meeting, that was discussed, and that Xi Jinping made some offers towards getting the AIIB and Silk Road ideas. Oh yeah, it was Li Keqiang. Sorry, yeah, right. But that was addressed. And secondly, here at Wilson last year, Dr. An Chong-yong, I believe, you know him, I suppose, Dr. An Chong-yong, brought up his proposal, which he discussed with Park Geun-hye, on calling on China to co-endorse a Northeast Asia Development Bank, like the AIIB, perhaps associated with the AIIB. And I wonder if you've looked into that. And then thirdly, I brought up this morning, and maybe you'd want to comment on this consortium between the southern corporations, the Hyundai Marine and POSCO and Korail, with Russia and North Korea, building this whole Razon area. I bet you have some things to say on that.
First of all, I'm the person to talk about what you just mentioned is more in details. I just proposed an idea when I talk about this OBOR means that means that China does not have interest in this northeastern part of Chinese continent and North Korea. There is a lot of development project is undergoing on. There's a two-man project, and so on. And the problem is the nuclear is just dominated of this Korean peninsula. So even though the current Korean government promote unification policy, talking about bonanza, but in fact there is rare dialogues between South and North. So I mean, there is lots of big company, Korea and Japan. Maybe lots of companies, in the United States may have interest in investing in North Korea, or not only for North Korea but also northeast part of China. So look at it. It's very look. If you look at the OBOR projects, why China intentionally missed this area? As I talked about, this is a very complicated area because of North Korea. So engaging North Korea and creating a lot of opportunities to be interaction. So I think it's very important step to stabilize of this area. And then we can talk about real unification in detailed process. Okay, sorry.
Hey, other questions? Yes, at the back. Am I seeing a hand? Okay, well here. Okay, this man is not touching his hair.
Okay, I have a question to Professor Michishita. You talked about probable or possible Korean, tilting toward China after the unification, but I already mentioned in the first panel, Korea might not do that. And you suggested some, the economic, trade volumes that Korea has with China. But if, does that, I wonder how reliable those indications, economic, indications are in predicting the Korea's posture after the unification. That's my first question. Secondly, Korea-Japan relationship. You talked about the Korean nationalism, I know, however, that Korean nationalism was somehow, not very, forward-looking, and it was somehow trapped by the past. And in that regard, I'd like to question if Japanese are helping Koreans to be freed from the past. Yeah, that's my second question.
Mm-hmm. Well, I didn't really say Korea will be tilting toward China. I said otherwise. I would say, well, now in the short run or to the mid run, Korea might be, shifting a little bit away from, moving a little bit away from the U.S. and Japan toward China. But there is a limit to what Korea can do, in my opinion. So I would say, in long run, Korea will actually come back toward our side because of the concerns that the country will come to have, either unified or South Korea alone, about increasing influence of China in the region. And I didn't really associate trade volume. I didn't discuss this today, and so I don't know which what kind of issue you are talking about, but I don't. Again, trade volume is Korea is actually really interdependent or dependent on Korean economy is dependent on its export to China. South Korea's half of its gross domestic products come from export, and among this half, 26% comes from or is produced by South Korea's export to China. So certainly, South Korean economy is heavily dependent on its interactions with China. So I would say, in short run, this will influence, South Korean behavior because maintaining amicable relationship with China is very important. However, Chinese economy will not keep growing forever at this pace. Already, Chinese economy has started to slow down. So the international communities have already started to talk about how to kind of create a situation where we don't necessarily have to rely on China as a locomotive. So Korea will think about the same thing in the long run. So I would say, my judgment based on trade volume between the two countries in the short run would be different from the one, my expectation of South Korean behavior in the long run. In terms of Korea-Japan relationship, unfortunately, South Korean nationalism is based on, kind of negative sentiments such as anti-Japanese or whatever, anti-colonialism. And South Korea is growing and becoming a much more respected and prosperous democratic nation. And if you talk to people from kind of developing countries in the Middle East, Asia, different parts of Asia, they really talk about South Korea as their model, right? So I would say already South Korea, by being prosperous, successful both politically, economically, and socially, we are really impressed by how South Korea is producing massive, very attractive, soft power products, such as dramas, music, whatever. So I would say, because South Korea is acquiring these capabilities, soft power already, I think there will be a time, if South Korean people understand this and South Korean leaders decide to use this as a new symbol, replacing old negative symbols, I think we can do it already.
Any response from any of the other panelists to that?
Okay. I think the two things I want to talk about in this current security structure in the Northeast is, one is the impact of domestic politics. I think this is an increasing phenomenon, especially for 6 countries who are involved in this Northeast Asian international relations. Maybe least for U.S. and other than that, and North Korea, China, Japan, South Korea, all is so worried about their domestic people's opinion. That leads to an hardline policy or nationalistic sentiment. So overblown, and in this situation, another part is, I think, U.S. policy and actually relation between the U.S. and China. The biggest difference between the U.S.-Soviet versus U.S.-China is U.S.-China is not unlike Soviet Union, relation with the Soviet Union, is double-sided. It's so interdependent. At the same time, they are suspicious about each other. So what's going to happen? This is like a big curse and big burden on us, because Korean Peninsula becomes test bed to test the other side intentions. Let me give you examples. It's happening and its frequency kind of increasing. Number one is CADIS, it's Air Defense Zone, unilateral declaration of Air Defense Zone. Second, THAAD, issues. And another issue, collective defense right of Japan. And the current issue is about South China Sea. You know, the two different sides. So it's pressuring Korea to pick the side. At the same time, test each other. Is the true intentions. That's why it's getting harder and getting difficult. South Korea is facing.
That's a great point.
Thank you. Sir, back at the back.
I'd like to ask my question to Ambassador Roy. I generally agreed with your description of the incompatible and conflicting strategic interests among the major powers who may not be wanting to get involved in the process of unification. Let's put aside the issues of denuclearization or the process of unification for that matter for the time being. But I want to come to your view on a feasibility or a viability of an alliance between the United States and a unified Korea. Whether, given having listened to all the comments that you made, China's position, what China's position will be on this issue, but at the same time, whether it would be helpful to the process of unification if Korea makes it very clear upfront that what kind of political position, security position that unified Korea would take. For example, if we take a goal of a neutralized unified Korea, how that would work. I don't want to go back to Mike Mansfield when he first brought up this idea, and there has been a lot of pieces about this topic in academia, and I did myself a couple of pieces on this topic of a unified neutral Korea. I don't want to talk too much, so I think I provided enough ground for you to make your response.
I believe that actually there's considerable convergence between the interests of the major countries. If you look at from the standpoint of, do they all have an interest in a stable and peaceful Northeast Asia? And I think they all do. So that I do not consider it an impossible goal to seek convergence between the strategic interests of the major powers. But Korea then becomes the potential pendulum that could disturb that strategic stability. Japan would be upset if it viewed the Korean Peninsula as becoming a power projection platform for the Chinese. Americans at one point had a ambition of using Korea as a power projection platform for non-regional interests, and the South Korean government, our good ally, disabused us. They don't wish to be used for that purpose. And I think the same thing applies to Japan. I think Korea would be resistant to being utilized by Japan for strategic purposes. And I think Russia could fit into that same question. So in my judgment, it's a realistic possibility to have all of the major powers agree that they want a unified Korean Peninsula to contribute to stability and peace in Northeast Asia. But the question is, how do you stabilize that? Countries change. Korea, a democracy. Let's assume that a unified Korea would be a democracy. Democracies sometimes go off in crazy kicks and don't necessarily contribute to stability. So you have to take those types of considerations into account. I believe that you probably need a stabilization mechanism, whether it's an outgrowth of the six-party talks, but it probably would need to involve the six parties. Do you need a U.S. Korean Peninsula security guarantee also? I don't think you should throw that out as a beginning. the sensitive part of the Korean Peninsula for China is the northern part. It's not inconceivable that China would find a residual U.S. security presence in the southern part of a unified Korean Peninsula as acceptable. That may not be their preference, but on the other hand, if they felt that it was unrealistic to think that they could completely sever those ties, we shouldn't give it away before you have seen what the circumstances are. There would have to be a combination of China's security interests, but that wouldn't automatically require them to be seen as trying to force the United States out of East Asia in a security as consideration. And China would have to consider how not having a U.S.-Korean security arrangement would affect Japan, and whether it would be feasible for the United States to keep its security relationship with Japan under circumstances where the Korean Peninsula was no longer part of the alliance system. So there are a lot of complex issues that have to be considered. But I don't think we should begin from the assumption that the strategic interests of the major powers inevitably are incompatible with each other. I think I've answered that as best I can.
Well, before we end, I want to make sure that we haven't given short shrift to Russia in this discussion, which of course has played an important role in the modern history of the Korean Peninsula and as a member of the six-party talks. Ambassador Roy has touched on it a few times, but I wanted to give all of you a chance to say anything about the Russian role or Russian interests, if you like, before we close. Maybe start at this end of the table and work back to Ambassador Roy. Any thoughts on Russian equities or interests or its role going forward?
Russian interest? Yeah, absolutely there are. But Putin, when a couple of years ago, President Putin visited South Korea. South Korea made a cooperation with Russia for providing kind of cooperative development project. It's called Eurasia Initiative. But it doesn't work out so far because I don't know why, but as we have seen, the North Korea is kind of function as a blockade. So it's the influence. I think the influence of Russia is still remain, but it is is kind of decreasing. But the big point of that influence might be energy resources, because the North Korean development in the future and Chinese demand is getting more and more higher. So, of course, Russian is still a good one partner of this region.
Okay, I think most regretful country in among the 6 countries that they chose the side too early. They're really regretting that they chose South Korea over North Korea in the early 90s, and they're trying to come back. And one more important thing is like developing Russian Far East, Siberia area. And one of the projects we talked about, and Ajin and all those consortiums, and that related to the Park Geun-hye's initiative. But all different issues come together, and at the same time, Russia can be a reactive. How U.S., Korea, Japan, military or any other cooperations. So if that's kind of a revival of the alliance, then Russia has to take another side. It's another choice of sides. So still kind of floating, but they're trying to come back. That's what I know. Thank you.
Japan is actually trying to improve its relationship with Russia, and for basically mainly two reasons. One is energy, because in 2011 big tsunami hit Japan, and we had a major nuclear disaster. And as a result, not many, only one or two nuclear reactors are now operating. So we are really suffering from a serious shortage of energy resources. So for a good, naturally we look to Russia to come up with improve its partnership and bilateral partnership, and we are thinking of developing different sources of energy, namely oil and natural gas. And a second reason is Japan would like to kind of use Russia as a counterweight to China. So this is a geostrategic objective that we have. But unfortunately, what happened in the Crimea and Ukraine really frustrated the Japanese effort to come up with a better or improved relationship with Russia. And but this is really having a negative influence in the Asian front, because being isolated, Russia is choosing to side with China and deepening its, political, military, other economic relationship with China. So this is really rather than being able to use Russia, China is using Russia for its strategic purposes. So I would say, after things get a little bit settled in European front, I would like to see some kind of realistic separation of our policy toward European Russia and Asia-Pacific Russia. We don't know how to do it, but and also Russia can be a positive factor on the Korean Peninsula issues. So we will hope to do a good job of doing that. Thank you.
Russia is a fairly minor factor in East Asian security affairs at the present time, but we make an enormous mistake if we underestimate the importance of the region to Russia. They have major Pacific territories. They have not forgotten, they are far removed from the European heart of Russia. Therefore, these territories are inherently vulnerable. They have not forgotten that Japan and the United States intervened in the eastern parts of Russia after World War I, during the Russian Civil War. We would make a fundamental error if we made the mistake that the United States and the European countries made in Europe in underestimating a weak Russia's fundamental security interests by pushing NATO expansion to the point where Russia has lashed back. We essentially would have been far better served if we had understood the existence of those traditional security concerns on the part of Russia and had substituted our wisdom for the inability of the Ukrainian government, which was corrupt and totally unable to provide the leadership of holding a fragile, brand new state whose eastern portions and western portions had different historical backgrounds. And instead, we let a tug of war between Russia and the West take place that was going to pull Ukraine apart. We should have substituted our wisdom and our understanding of Russia's security interests and used that to try to have Ukraine bridge between East and West rather than becoming a tug-of-war object. The reason I mention that is we will make the same error in East Asia if we ignore Russia's security concerns in Northeast Asia. It not only still has the unresolved territorial issue with Japan, but it also is the second with the United States. It's one of the two top nuclear powers in the world. It produces first-rate military equipment And through arms sales, it can destabilize East Asia by becoming an arms supplier. And I think an arms race in East Asia is a real possibility over the next couple of decades in which Russia could turn out to be a major player. So I think that I am deeply upset when I will attend discussions of East Asian security matters and the conversation will go on for hours and nobody mentions Russia. It's a very dangerous perception, and I hope that we will have the wisdom to understand Russia's security interests, even if it is not projecting them very effectively to the rest of us.
Well, thank you, Professor Cha, Professor Kim, Professor Michishita, and Ambassador Roy. Thanks to all of you for attending this afternoon and all day. I'd like to invite James Person back to the stage.
Great. Well, thank you, Robert, for moderating. Great way to wrap up the day, and love the fact that we could bring in the history. Let me just thank the Ministry of Unification again for sponsoring this event. Thanks also to our colleagues at Gyeongnam University for co-organizing, especially to Professor Shin Jong-dae. We also had a number of sponsors. Korean Air provided air tickets to many of our participants coming from Korea, so thanks to Korean Air. The sponsors of the Hyundai Motor Korea Foundation Center, of course, Hyundai and the Korea Foundation, thank you to them. And none of this would have been possible without the support of my colleagues here at the Wilson Center, our research assistants, Soo Jung Hong, Kayla Orda, Min Jung Ko, and Solji Park, and my colleagues in the History and Public Policy program and working on the Korea project, Peter Bierstecker and Evan Pekolsky. So thanks to them, and thanks to you all for joining us. So thank you.
I really enjoyed your comments.
Oh, thank you very much.
I hope we can have lunch
Oh,
sometime.
definitely.
Yeah, I'd really like to benefit